Mathews, who is from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Department of Anthropology. And he will talk about asylum seekers in Hong Kong since the handover. Please.
I can't sit and talk at the same time, so I'm going to stand if you don't mind. Also, I don't think I need a microphone. I have a pretty loud voice. Okay. Most of the papers in this conference are about how Hong Kong has changed since the handover. This is an extraordinarily important topic, of course, but asylum seekers, whom I've been asked to talk about, have little to do with these changes, other than the fact that asylum seekers can come from any country in the world in Hong Kong, except for China, since Hong Kong now belongs to China. China's influence has had minimal bearing on the treatment of asylum seekers in Hong Kong. Nonetheless, I argue that asylum seekers today, as was not the case a decade ago, have unwittingly become a symbol of post-handover Hong Kong. As asylum seekers have become more visible in Hong Kong, they have been embraced by some, particularly by the young and liberal in the city. In this paper, based on my own interactions with asylum seekers over the past 12 years, and my interviews of long-term asylum seekers, I depict the situation of asylum seekers and how it's changed over the years. I explore the contradictions in Hong Kong government policy towards asylum seekers. And I explore how asylum seekers have become entirely unexpectedly a symbol for young people of non-Chinese Hong Kong today. South Asian and African asylum seekers began coming to Hong Kong in the wake of 9/11 and the tightening of visa restrictions in other developed countries. Hong Kong has become a significant initial destination for asylum seekers from Asian and African countries, but not from China. The first asylum seekers I know of came in 2004, with numbers slowly increasing. There are some 10,000 asylum seekers in Hong Kong at present. Most are male between the ages of 20 and 40, although there is an increasing number of females due to domestic helpers declaring themselves as asylum seekers once their contracts end. The large majority of asylum seekers are from South Asia, with some 10% from sub-Saharan Africa, and a small but increasing number from Southeast Asia. Hong Kong's population is largely made up of those whose families fled China at some point over the past 60 years. Nonetheless, Hong Kong has long suffered from panics over illegal immigrants, from the outcries over Vietnamese boat people in the 1980s and 1990s to worries in the 2000s over mainland women seeking to deliver their babies in Hong Kong. The number of asylum seekers has gone up significantly in Hong Kong in recent years. Asylum seekers arrive in Hong Kong by airplane, although many are increasingly turned back at the airport, or come by boat illegally into Hong Kong from China. They declare themselves as asylum seekers under the United Nations Convention Against Torture, to which Hong Kong is a signatory. Once they're in Hong Kong, they can apply easily, with no initial screening, to be asylum seekers. After several months of bureaucratic waiting, they can begin obtaining a government stipend of Hong Kong $1,200 of food coupons, $1,500 of rental support and transportation money, about Hong Kong $3,000 in all of food, rental, support, and other aid each month. This may seem like a large amount of money to people from the developing world, but it's not enough to survive on in Hong Kong. Housing generally can't be found for this amount of money. Asylum seekers are prohibited from working, subject to a 2-year jail term if they're caught working. Although because of stringent Hong Kong rules of evidence, it's often extremely difficult to catch asylum seekers who are working. Because this stipend is not enough to live on, most asylum seekers, unless they're fortunate enough to receive ongoing charity payments or have generous lovers to support them, work illegally. Asylum seekers are in a liminal status, subject to denial of their claims. What asylum seekers seek, as a rule, is refugee status. Hong Kong itself does not accept refugees, but countries such as Canada and the United States do. If one is accepted as a refugee, this is a step towards eventually becoming a citizen of the country one is settled in. Over these years, only a very tiny percentage of asylum seekers in Hong Kong have been granted refugee status, either through the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or more recently through the Hong Kong government itself, in its unified screening mechanism, enabling them to eventually be resettled in the United States and Canada. The UNHCR was widely hated by asylum seekers during the time it made judgments on asylum seekers' claims. Only 5 to 10% of asylum seekers attained refugee status from the UNHCR, and there was no appeal mechanism for those whose claims were rejected. The Hong Kong government's unified screening mechanism replaced the UNHCR in 2014. It has granted refugee status to fewer than 1% of claimants, a vanishingly small success rate. On the other hand, the United Screening Mechanism's judgments are subject to appeals launched in Hong Kong courts, as the UNHCR was not. Thus, asylum seekers may, through the appeals process, effectively have their stays in Hong Kong extended indefinitely. Some asylum seekers whose claims are rejected are deported back to their home countries if they sign forms consenting to deportation. But most appeal their cases again and again and wait in limbo in Hong Kong, often for many years. Increasingly, it has become apparent to many asylum seekers in Hong Kong that the only way they can alleviate their situation of being in limbo with their life stalled is to get married to a local or to someone with a suitable developed world passport. But this is much easier said than done. I've taught a class of asylum seekers in Chungking Mansions every Saturday over the past 12 years, with some of my students being the same people all 12 years. They get tired when I teach it. From both my own recollections and from what students recall, it's readily apparent that there have been significant changes in how asylum seekers are treated in Hong Kong. In the early 2000s, when asylum seekers first began coming to Hong Kong, the Hong Kong government seemed to have no idea how to deal with asylum seekers. For a period of about a year in 2005, the government was arresting asylum seekers on sight. Once this policy was ended, the situation of asylum seekers remained tenuous, in that the UNHCR did not want to be administering the claims of asylum seekers, nor did the Hong Kong government itself. Asylum seekers, still comparatively unusual in Hong Kong, remained anomalous. Over the years, however, various NGOs were established to help asylum seekers. Lawyers funded by the government emerged to aid asylum seekers, and the various steps in the process of asylum seekers became regularized. An asylum seeker from Russia elaborated on these changes. In his words, "I first came here in 2006. In those times, it was much harder to get assistance. There were some NGOs, but not many like today. The process now is easier. You can understand it, because NGOs and the Hong Kong government, too, will explain it to you. Before, you put in an application to the UN, but the UN did not tell you what the process was. And if you got rejected, you could not appeal. Once you were rejected, it was done. There was no other mechanism. Now, if you're rejected, you can appeal." In Hong Kong, the treatment of asylum seekers has become standardized. Not just NGOs, but immigration itself supplies information on its website. Yes, the situation for asylum seekers has become better, but this doesn't mean that it's any good. You're still stuck here forever. It's because of appeals that asylum seekers like him can remain in Hong Kong indefinitely, albeit in a limbo of illegal employment. However, the fact remains that almost no one is granted refugee status and must wait an extraordinarily long time for the all but inevitable rejection of one's case to reach its legal conclusion. A Central African spoke to me about how he has wasted the best years of his life doing nothing in Hong Kong. As he said, "I came here in 2006 as an asylum seeker. In the beginning, there was no such thing as food or rent assistance. From that perspective, some people could say, yes, it's changed, it's gotten better. But if you're talking about how immigration handles cases, from that perspective, things have not changed much. Some people have been here 14, 15, 16 years, and they're still in the system, still not accepted. I think the Hong Kong government's real purpose is to discourage people from coming. If someone comes here at age 20, you're now 35. You've wasted the best years of your life. If only they could process the case faster, very soon I would have known my fate, and I could have looked for other options in my life. But they've kept me here for so long. It would have been better for me to have known my fate after 1 year, rather than having to endlessly wait like this." Now, one reason for the endless delays in the processing of asylum seeker cases is bureaucratic slowness. But perhaps the biggest reason at present is Hong Kong law, allowing court appeals to stretch on endlessly. This, in a Hong Kong that in other respects seems to be moving away from the strict and objective rule of law, may seem to be a very good thing. However, since almost everyone will be rejected in the end, these appeals are all but hopeless. More, they in effect aid those asylum seekers who come to Hong Kong for economic reasons, but hurt those who come to Hong Kong in genuine fear for their lives. Those who come to Hong Kong to work illegally, and many, many people do, can in all likelihood work for many years, saving a considerable amount of money before eventually returning home. I know Indian asylum seekers who have financed their siblings' weddings, rebuilt the family home, supported aging parents, and financed their own future businesses, all through their Hong Kong earnings as asylum seekers. On the other hand, those asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution in their home countries, genuine asylum seekers, if you will, I don't like those labels, but are often afraid to work illegally for fear of being deported and can only stew for many years on end. Paradoxically, adherence to rule of law in Hong Kong helps to create a situation where fake asylum seekers are helped and real asylum seekers are penalized. It seems quite plausible that Hong Kong is making use of this situation in order to maintain an illegal labor force, one that it need not legalize and need not prosecute, except to a very limited extent, but that aids Hong Kong employers who might otherwise go out of business. Now, as I've already mentioned here, there's a number of contradictions in the situation of asylum seekers in Hong Kong, and let me go through 5 of these. 1, Hong Kong treats asylum seekers pretty well compared to most other societies in East Asia and in the world, in terms of the freedom to move around and the aid it provides. You know, asylum seekers are not jailed, they're not put in camps anywhere. These have become better in the last decade. At the same time, compared to many other societies, such as European societies with a success rate of 50% or more to be accepted as a refugee, the success rate in Hong Kong is virtually 0. Why does Hong Kong treat its asylum seekers comparatively well while giving them virtually no chance to be recognized as refugees? 2, Hong Kong's minimal stipend for asylum seekers makes it necessary for many to work. It threatens severe punishment for those caught working, but Hong Kong legal provisions are such that few get caught, since much evidence is required. Is this gap between threatened punishment and its very minimal enforcement a result of Hong Kong's vaunted rule of law, or is it a more cynical strategy of threatening asylum seekers to appease Hong Kong's mass media and Chinese base, while at the same time allowing for a flexible illegal labor force? Or alternatively, is it simply a matter of policy decisions whose effects have been unnoticed? After all, a few thousand illegal employees is a drop in the bucket compared to Hong Kong's population of 7 million. 3, this creates a situation such that Hong Kong's strict adherence to the rule of law with regards to asylum seekers means that asylum seekers in Hong Kong using asylum in order to work and make money greatly benefit, whereas those seeking asylum in order to escape political persecution are hurt. Is this a byproduct of a humane policy gone awry, or is it deliberately cynical? These 3 contradictions lead to 2 further contradictions. Okay, number 4, in the words of a West African asylum seeker, relying on your case isn't possible. Getting married is all you can do, marrying a local and then getting your residence in Hong Kong. Indeed, the chances of being accepted as a refugee are so infinitesimally small that marriage to a local is the best bet. But this, of course, is a difficult proposition, since men like him have almost no money and are dependent upon their Hong Kong wives for years before they themselves can get a Hong Kong ID card and a right to work. And by the way, if anybody here wants to get married, let me know, I can arrange it. Nonetheless, in a Hong Kong becoming increasingly Sino-centric, not just in a cultural but in an ethnic sense as well, with, by some accounts, non-Chinese and non-white people increasingly marginalized by Hong Kong immigration, the only viable way for asylum seekers to escape their situation is to marry a Hong Konger and become a Hong Konger. making Hong Kong not Chinese, but potentially more racially mixed or foreign. This leads to a fifth conclusion. 5. In a Hong Kong in which many people, particularly young people, have increasingly lost trust in anything the Hong Kong government and its authorities say or do, some Hong Kong asylum seekers have become local heroes, particularly to young people. They are symbols of a different international Hong Kong. This fifth contradiction is what I will now discuss in the concluding part of my paper. A West African asylum seeker said this about how Hong Kong has changed in its attitudes. As he said, I got here in 2005. Things have changed very huge. Hong Kong people treat you differently now. We've been going to schools talking about racial issues, and that's one reason why Hong Kong has become a friendlier place for asylum seekers. It was much worse before. It was very difficult to make friends with Chinese. Nobody wanted to sit next to you in the MTR. They all move away. We put on a program called African My Neighbor, trying to educate local people. For the past 5 or 6 years, there have been a lot of changes. Ethnic minorities are becoming more involved in the system than they were in the past. Police told me that they wanted to see the next generation of police in Hong Kong include Africans. We were very excited to hear this. Yes, students used to ask, why do you people come here in an unfriendly way? Now it's different. Now they really want to talk to you. Lots of students come to Chungking Mansions now. I help them out by answering their questions. I answer the question of one student, and then 10 more come and listen to me, including their teacher. Indeed, in my own class of asylum seekers, so many young Hong Kongers want to attend that often they outnumber asylum seekers themselves. I've had to vet all potential Hong Kong attendees since so many want to come and space is limited. Asylum seekers come to my classes at Chinese University, and they are treated as minor celebrities. Other students want nothing more than to talk with them about their lives. This is happening in a larger sense as well. Chungking Mansions, once thought of as an infamous den of sleaze and vice, is now, as the above quotation indicates, at times humming with secondary school students, all seeking to talk with Africans and South Asians. This sometimes extends beyond conversation. An asylum seeker I was with recently gave a talk, after which he received a text message from a young Chinese woman in the audience, "Please marry me." While the asylum seekers I know continue to suffer economically, their social lives in Hong Kong have, for many, become quite rich. Now, my sample here is small, and I can't base large conclusions on what I see in my own interactions in my Chungking Mansions class or at CUHK, where asylum seekers regularly attend classes. Nonetheless, it seems clear from all the evidence I've been able to gather, as well as from the testimony of asylum seekers, that something has changed in Hong Kong attitudes, particularly those of young Hong Kong people. This, I conjecture, is because many of Hong Kong's young people, so tired of their government's increasingly enforced Chineseness, are looking for anything that might symbolize Hong Kong's non-Chineseness. Hong Kong's asylum seekers are exactly such a symbol, not of the boring, developed world of old white expats like me, but of the exciting developing world whose prospects lie in the future. Asylum seekers wait in Hong Kong indefinitely as permanent outsiders unable to legally work. But they nonetheless have been embraced by some of the young as a symbol of Hong Kong's internationalization. This would have been impossible to imagine in Hong Kong 20 years ago, assumed by everyone to be bound to become more and more Chinese in its identity, and less international in its orientation. This would have been impossible to imagine 10 years ago, when asylum seekers were beleaguered and marginalized in Hong Kong, and seen generally as wholly foreign and other. But this, indeed, is what has happened today. Asylum seekers have become key symbols for many young people of Hong Kong's vibrant non-Chineseness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mathews, for your